of all, Dr. Andrea Dunn is the founder and executive director of Let's Beehive Incorporated, a 501c3 nonprofit organization located in Orlando. She's very passionate about reducing the rates of HIV and AIDS in the community and helping to fill gaps in knowledge as it relates to HIV education, awareness, and prevention services among at-risk populations, especially heterosexual women and youth of color, who are underserved and disproportionately affected by this disease, as many of us on this call in this meeting are aware. Dr. Richelle Joe is an associate professor of counselor education at the University of Central Florida, and in addition to training future mental health practitioners, marriage and family, and school counselors, she also engages in services and research that focus on culturally responsive engagement with underserved and marginalized individuals and families. She's particularly dedicated to raising awareness about HIV and addressing its prevention and treatment through a psychosocial lens. Dr. Shan-Estelle is a former and continuing member of QRDG that many of us on this call know. She's an associate professor of anthropology and coordinator of global health programs at Rollins College. Previously, she was a postdoc research associate in the AIDS program at Yale's School of Medicine. She's a medical anthropologist by training who conducts mixed methods and community-engaged research, as well as research on improving medical technologies, understanding patients' perceptions of risk and well-being, and identifying structural facilitators and barriers to access and retention in healthcare. With that, I will turn it over to the illustrious research team.
Thanks. I'm starting, and let me just say this is kind of a homecoming for me, even though I've been attending these regularly. I don't think I've presented in a while, so it's really exciting to be able to share what we've been up to with this particular group. Who has control of the slides?
I believe it's Andrea. It's Andrea.
Yeah, Shan-Estelle, I do.
Oh, okay. Can you go to the next slide, please?
Absolutely.
Thank you. So here's what we're doing today. I'm just going to explain how this research is funded, because it's directly tied to how we have come together as a team, but then also how we have designed the research. And then we'll explain the specifics of our project. And then the last thing that we'll do is we'll talk about how some of the issues that we've come across as far as doing community engaged research. So our project is called Removing Obstacles to HIV Prevention for Black Women in Orange County, Florida, which is where we are all based. You can go on to the next slide. So IRL is one program of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and its particular setup is that, as a foundation, they have different kind of funding themes that they follow for a few years. We are the 6th cohort, so there's another cohort that's after us that is focused specifically on structural racism and dismantling structural racism for healthcare purposes to bring about a culture of health, which is one of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's kind of important taglines. And so what IRL is composed of is that they are funding research teams of 3, where you have 2 people who are in a role as a researcher and 1 person in a role as a community partner. And so they have particularly funded us, which is really exciting. And so it's about 15 teams a year. And so, like I said, they've had 7 iterations so far. We're the 6th cohort. And so it's a 3-year project. And so what's really nice about it is that you're also joining a true fellowship, where we have weekly meetings to talk about community engaged research, where we are presenting about our work in progress. And then there's also annual meetings where we have been meeting up to talk more about our particular theme, but also just to get to know some of the other people in the cohort. So that has been really beneficial. It's not just a funding mechanism where you apply to get this grant and then you're off alone, in isolation as a team doing this work. There's a lot of support. They wanted to make sure that we wrote out collaborative agreements at the beginning to talk about how this research is working. So it's a 3-year grant from start to finish. And the first 6 months is kind of lead up time. The last 6 months is kind of phase out and doing additional dissemination, because ideally, they are encouraging us to disseminate our research before that point. And the actual research project timeline is 2 years. Next slide, please. So what we are interested in specifically is we are trying to understand how the ending the HIV epidemic is operating both at this kind of local community level, but then also at this broader national level. As you're probably aware, there are 57 priority jurisdictions that the CDC and the Department of Health and Human Services has identified as having new HIV diagnoses going, numbers going in the wrong direction. And Orange County is one of them, which comprises Central Florida. So Orlando, although it's an entire region, right? There's no walls around this county. So there are additional areas that are also, having new HIV diagnoses, but the concentration has been, when you look at Orange County, it lights up, along with 6 other counties in Florida. I don't know if, is this still my slide?
I think I pick up right here.
Okay,
so
I'm gonna hand it over to you.
Yeah, and no, this is exciting. So I am from one of the community partners as far as our trio for research. And so I just wanted to share a little bit of information about our organization and what we do and what we offer. So Let's Beehive is an acronym for Let's Be HIV Educated. And we are one of the only organizations in Orlando who is predominantly focused on HIV prevention, care, and treatment for women and youth in our community. And so it was like the perfect fit for this opportunity to be able to be a part of this research, because this is our target population and who we work for. It is our mission to provide innovative health education workshops and prevention programs, more specifically for people who are underrepresented or disproportionately affected by this disease. And so we do focus on a lot of awareness, prevention, but we really hope that the work that we're doing will eventually help to reduce HIV transmission in our community. We also want to help improve therapeutic outcomes among those who are living with HIV. And so oftentimes, as a founder of this organization, a lot of people always wonder, how did I get involved in this work? Or why am I interested in helping individuals? And so I feel like as a Black woman living in a geographical region where there's a high rate of HIV, it's really important for me personally, but also in care. I have been working in the emergency department for about 9.5 years now. And I have about 14 years of experience in pharmacy care, specifically in the clinical realm. And I'm a board certified pharmacist, so I see the importance of treatment when it comes to HIV and how we can really intersect the importance of treatment as prevention, as well as other modes or other forms of prevention. So I get very excited about this topic and this disease because it's the treatments that are helping individuals who are diagnosed with HIV live a long time. And so our mission and our tagline that we basically use is to use health education as a form of natural medicine to eradicate this disease. And so I'm very excited to be a part of this research group. And one of the things that we focused on, or we are actively working on here in the Orlando, Central Florida area, is really helping women and healthcare providers understand that PrEP is an option for us too. And so these are just a few examples of our very first multimedia prep campaign that was launched in March of 22 last year during Women's History Month, which was really huge for us. It's the very first multimedia campaign specifically for Black women that was launched in Orlando, and we were the second in the state of Florida to be able to accomplish this goal. And so we've developed a She is Prepalicious HIV prevention program as well that we will be launching and continuing throughout activities that we did this year as well as upcoming years. And so far we've reached over 4 million people. And these are just some examples, just so you can kind of see what was displayed in our multimedia campaign. And these were women who actually live in Orlando and who are community influencers and people who are respected in our community. And I think it worked well and resonated with our population that we're targeting with HIV prevention for Black women. And so now I will hand over the remainder of this presentation to my colleague, Dr. Richelle Joe.
Well, not the remainder, couple slides, and then I'm gonna hand it back over. So I always love hearing Andrea talk about Let's Beehive because they do really important work in the community. And I had encountered her prior to this project and had also worked with Shan-Estelle. And when this opportunity came up, it just made sense to bring everybody together because of the importance that we place on the topic and the population and the work that we had already individually been doing. So as Shan-Estelle talked earlier about the IRL program, Robert Wood Johnson, one thing that's really important to note about that program is that each year there is a theme. So when they're selecting groups to be a part of a particular cohort, they're looking for us to address the theme in that application. And so the theme that was in place for our cohort was structural racism. And so as we are approaching this concern about the obstacles to HIV prevention for Black women, we are considering how racism and structural racism is a part of that. And you'll see that in our research questions, but also in the approach that we're taking to this particular project. So the research questions that are guiding our work, our primary research question is, how can local healthcare providers prioritize the sexual health and HIV prevention needs of Black cisgender women in their services to be in alignment with the Orange County EHE plan? And then sort of sub-questions to that to really get into how we get some answers there are first focused on Black cisgender women's sexual health and HIV prevention needs. So trying to figure out what are those needs, what are Black women's experiences in the healthcare setting as it relates to seeking general healthcare as well as sexual healthcare. And then connected to that, how, if at all, are local service providers engaging with Black cisgender women to provide HIV prevention services, including PrEP. So that is, with this project, those are the things that we're seeking to get some answers to. And if you go to the next slide, I'll address the how the structural racism piece it really becomes a part of this project. Because we are focused on the needs of Black women, not only are we looking at this through a structural racism lens, we're also considering the intersection of racism and sexism and how it impacts the health outcomes and experiences of Black women. So we are specifically using a gendered racism lens to address this issue. And specifically, gendered racism is looking at, and I love this quote here, the structure that how the racial oppression of Black women is structured by both racist and ethnicist perceptions of gender roles. So again, how racism and sexism overlap in the intersectional way is really the crux of the research project that we're doing. And when we've talked about this project before and why it's important and you know, the emphasis here on the gendered racism, we've considered it really very much through like a historical perspective. So Andrea, if you'd click one more time, when we've talked about it, we've related it to the historical experiences of gendered racism that Black women have had here in the United States. So if we even go back to the experiences of enslaved women who were experimented upon to establish the field of gynecology, that history impacts our present. And so when we've approached this, and when we've considered how we would structure our work, we have thought about those experiences that Black women have had related to healthcare, related to their own physical health and their sexual health, and how in many cases they have experienced a particular type of oppression that has affected their outcomes. So theoretically and sort of philosophically, that's the groundwork of this, and how when we framed our proposal for IRL, we used this gendered racism lens to speak to the unique concerns of Black cisgender women as it relates to HIV. So I realized we haven't paused for any questions yet, so let's do that for a moment, because we've switched off a couple of times, but we haven't paused for any questions. So are there questions before Shan-Estelle takes us into the timeline?
I guess I have one kind of practical question is, if you had a 6 month, I think it sounds like a fabulous program, the Robert Wood Johnson program. If you have a 6 month kind of settling in and a 6 months transitioning out, where are you at this point in your project?
So actually, if you want to go to the next slide, I can explain that with a slide. We have a slide for that. So we just started year 3 this month. Year 3 of the grant, not year 3 of the project. Do you see what I mean? So our first year was half involved with, right, the getting settled. I really like that phrase. And then starting getting IRB approval, getting budget things actually distributed, and working out on the collaborative pieces. And then the second half of that was involving starting to recruit in the community, trying to make sure that people understood that we were out here and that we're working on this project. And so the majority of our second year has involved recruiting in the community, and then also conducting one-on-one interviews. So our proposed design involved doing 100 interviews, and we completed 75 before moving on to the concept mapping piece, where we have actually just started that, and we've been doing that officially since September of this year. If you want to go on to the next slide, I can explain the concept mapping part really briefly. So as far as our methods are concerned, we also did a set of one-on-one, and sometimes people coming together as a group of providers, interviews with healthcare providers in order to understand their perspective. And then our second method, in addition to interviewing, has been the concept mapping. So does that answer your question, Florida?
Sorry. Yes, thanks a lot. And are there other questions, since I've popped right in? Okay.
Okay, so seeing no hands, one thing that I just want to also mention is that part of the timeline also involves us analyzing this data as well, because as part of our concept mapping method, we've recruited a body of stakeholders, almost like an advisory board, but we have invited them to co-analyze this data with us. So if we can go on to the next slide, I can briefly explain concept mapping. So concept mapping is a method that has existed since the 1990s, and it involves this very localized, generating local understandings about a particular issue. The process here is on the left, and it involves this kind of movement through these steps of starting with a focus prompt, trying to understand essentially what are the map at the end is trying to understand what are the borders and the edges of a particular domain related to trying to understand a specific issue, right? So for us, that is essentially, what can the community do in order to understand, in order to make sure that there are no more Black women in Central Florida who get a new HIV diagnosis. And so we are at the point of structuring the statements, just to give you an idea. So we have talked with our body of stakeholders. They have generated a set of statements that we're working with right now, at which point we will give that back to them once we've kind of processed it and broken it down into individualized pieces in order to do the analysis. And that involves a set of a process of sorting those items, having them sort those items, and also rate them along certain criteria, like how important is this this particular issue, right, to understanding how do we get no more Black women with HIV. And then it creates this particular map of different points, and we hopefully will be able to use that set of maps and those pieces of information in order to turn it into action with going forward, as far as understanding what the community wants to see happen. So next slide. And that one's yours, Andrea.
Yes, I was trying to unmute. Thank you. So this is a picture of our river of life, and this is a requirement that we needed to do during one of our sharing sessions through IRL. And it just shows pretty much where we give an update of where we are with our research to our cohorts and our research leaders through the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And so it just starts with the origin and where we were. If we start to the top of the left, and then how we started to develop growth within the team and learning all the IRL processes, community engagement, some of the things that we experienced as challenges once we started online recruitment. And then if you look at like the middle layer, we started our pre-screening process. And then at the bottom is really what we wanted to talk about today is some of the challenges that we can have with online research, because we did have some bouts of experiences with online scammers as we were trying to reach our target population, which were Black women stakeholders and providers that we really wanted in our river, or what you see in the picture there. And so that there's barriers and different layers to get to that population without, weeding everything out, making sure that we get rid of things that really don't apply. And so just moving forward with, everything we went through with COVID and really trying to recruit during this research process and some of the challenges that we experienced. But this is just more of a timeline of an update of what we did and how we had to present it to the team. And so we give frequent sharing sessions and updates to share with the cohort of what we're experiencing. And then we are also able to get additional support. And then believe it or not, a lot of other teams were experiencing some of the same things as well. So we learned that we weren't the only ones, and it was very beneficial. So as each of you are preparing and may have experienced some of these things as well, hopefully that the information that we provide today will help you overcome some of those challenges. And I will pass it on back to Dr. Joe.
Thanks. So as was mentioned, like through this process, like we geared up, we started things going, we were rolling, we got our IRB approval, we got all the people in place, we started our recruitment, we had a town hall, we were rolling along pretty well. We had a holiday sort of celebration, got people together, we were recruiting, doing some interviews, things were going along swimmingly. That's my little pun to reference the River of Life. Things were going along swimmingly, and then we noticed that almost overnight, we've got a tremendous response to our recruitment. And we had developed, put systems in place so that people could, when they saw the recruitment materials, that they would be able to, in a very streamlined way, acknowledge their interest in the study, and then, see our informed consent information, and go through the process of really getting signed up for the study and getting to an appointment for an interview. So we had developed like a really good flow to get people recruited and get people like signed up for an interview so that we could interview them. And we were going along and doing really well. And then we noticed that we got like all these responses. And so there was some excitement around that, until we realized that there was a likelihood that many of those people who had responded and signed up for interviews were not likely eligible for the study. And the prime thing that made them ineligible for the study was geographic location. Because this is a study that is focused on Orange County, Florida, we needed people to reside in Orange County, Florida. And we found that people were responding who didn't live in Orange County, or not Orange County, Florida. They didn't live in Florida, and some of them didn't live in the United States of America or in even North America. We recognized that we had been inundated by a number of people who were fraudulent to those responses. And so that sort of led us to think about, okay, how do we address, this issue? Because this wasn't something that we had thought about. And so I'll talk a little bit about like what we found in the literature to inform some decisions, and then I'll talk briefly about the decision that we made related to this particular challenge with recruitment and data collection. So when we consulted the literature to try to like find some answers to how to handle this issue, we saw that we weren't the first ones to have this problem, which was comforting to us to an extent, but it did provide some insight on how we might move forward. And so in the literature, it talks about like different types of sort of fraudulent or ineligible responses that you might find. So you might have people who are responding multiple times in a particular study, or you might have, like in our case, where people, say that they're eligible for a study, but in fact, they don't meet the eligibility requirements. And of course, we recognize that, part of the motivation for that is that there was an incentive to study participation. So in the literature, there are some suggestions about how to deal with that. So things like using the CAPTCHA software to prevent ballot stuffing, collecting timestamps, IP addresses, geolocation, could be methods to determine like where people physically are located. However, they acknowledge that with many of these suggestions, that there are some ethical concerns in many cases, and then there also are some sort of practical concerns about how to implement some of that. Even acknowledging that using, for instance, geolocation is not always accurate. So if you solely rely on that, then you might be ruling out people who are in fact eligible for the study. There was also suggestions about like using search engines to look up phone numbers and addresses, or people's publicly available profiles on things like social media or LinkedIn and things like that. And we recognized that that was completely invasive and not a method that we wanted to engage in order to like verify people's eligibility. There were also conversations about like having a multi-page or a longer consent form when people are responding to a participant sort of recruitment effort online, with the idea being that you would tire out people who weren't necessarily eligible for the study, because the process to get signed up would just be more lengthy. And so if people were scammers or fraudulent, that they just sort of fall out. But that also means that you might exhaust people who are eligible for your process as well. And then other things like including statements about compensation being based on eligibility, putting those things in the informed consent. And so these were all things that we sort of thought about and talked about and tried to figure out what would be the best method for us. If you go to the next slide, Andrea. We also like found like there are even ways to establish like an algorithm of some sort to determine whether or not someone might be fraudulent. And we thought that this was interesting. It's not necessarily the approach that we took, but it was interesting just to think about like how what things you might look at for a particular individual to determine if they are in fact eligible for your study or in fact are fraudulent. And this is just an example taken from this particular article where they developed like a point system where they gave like a respondent particular points and then decided on like what is a number that could indicate whether or not people were eligible for that. So those were, again, some things that we saw in the literature when we were trying to figure out what we would do. So if you go to the next slide, I'll talk about what we did really briefly, and then we'll get into some questions. So we recognized that, again, the streamlined process that we had established was good in that it was easy for people to sign up, but the drawback, of course, is that it made it too easy for people who were not eligible to sign up. And so we recognized that we needed to make a change in that process. So, you know, we talked it through and then consulted with our IRB, and my institution is the IRB that we went through. We very helpful initially in terms of giving us some insight on like what might be some processes that we would need to go through. They just didn't really have any answers. However, when we made our decisions and determined how we would adjust our protocol, like the acceptance of it was pretty, you know, pretty easy once we had determined what we would do. And what we decided to do was that although we had that really nice flow that was pretty easy, that we needed to actually disrupt that flow a little bit and include a screening process. So we added a stage for the screening so that people could initially indicate their interest in the study, but before they could move forward to actually get signed up for an interview, that they would have to be verified by a member of our team. So because of like geographic location was the primary piece that we were focusing on, we determined methods where people could verify their address. And that could be, they could tell us their address, they could show us an ID, they could talk about like the neighborhood that they lived in or some markers physically that are specific to where they live, so that we could determine that they did in fact live within Orange County, Florida. We found that the screening process was effective, like that fixed the issue, that the people who were not eligible, we communicated to them that they didn't meet the geographic requirement for eligibility for the study, and we're able to include people who do meet all of their requirements for the study. But we did acknowledge that it slowed down the process some bit, and the whole experience of dealing with those scammers, it really kind of disrupted the momentum that we had at the point. So that was a major like challenge that we had to overcome, the momentum that we had sort of built up and the time that it took to fix all of that so that we could actually move forward. But we did find that the inclusion of that additional step of the screening process was able to resolve the issue. And so once we had that resolved, we were able to continue with our recruitment, to continue with the interviewing process, resulting in ultimately the 75 individuals that we interviewed for the study. So if we go to the next slide, or we're ready for some discussion time. If you all have questions, we also have some questions that we want to use to facilitate some discussion, and we can go from there. So.
Yeah, if I could just add one thing here too, Richelle, I just really wanted to make it known too that what we identified in this process was we used Calendly, and that's how we were able to identify that their IP address was located in some areas of Africa. And so this happened after we shared our research project on our Facebook page for Let's Beehive, and we realized that we were connecting with women who were in Africa. And so even though they weren't a part, it was exciting to see that they wanted to be a part of it, but just based on the geographical location and regions that we could not. And so we had to make some changes there. But that was one of the key points of us identifying, was being able to use Calendly. And that's where they showed us the location and where we were able to start narrowing it down from there, and using that also as a tool to confirm with, in addition to everything else that we did. So just wanted to add that in really quickly.
I guess first, are there questions? Because again, we talked a lot. So if there are questions from folks, and then we can get into these questions up here. And I think there might be one more question on the screen too, Andrea.
Deanne, go right ahead.
Hey, this was a great presentation. I feel like these things happen more and more, like, as time goes on. How did the women respond to that extra step? I know you said it slowed things down, but, you know, like, what was their response? Did they feel it was like less community focused, more, did they understand?
I did a lot of those phone calls, and it really didn't affect anything. So we had a screening process already in place because we had certain eligibility criteria that we had to go through in order to meet those criteria. The problem was that we were doing that step at the interview and not before that. So it would be one of those things where when we got to the interview, we might realize that there's a person, you know, who isn't eligible, and we would end there. So in the phone call, it was actually just, you know, these are the criteria. They should have already seen that, because when they filled out their interest form, we had the eligibility of it right there, so that they could look at it in order to know what the eligibility were, so that we could ask them. But in the actual phone, each of those was only 2 minutes long. The only issue is that the IRB would not allow us to collect that information as far as their the information about where they actually live. So we couldn't collect it. So it was one of those things that was like, how would you like to tell us that you are a resident of Orange County, and then leave it open for them to answer that question using the ways that Richelle had described. So it wasn't actually a problem at all.
Okay, awesome, thank you.
Yeah,
I had a question.
A follow-on to the question from Deanne is, were the interviews ultimately by phone also? In other words, was there a chance to either meet in person or meet on Zoom with the people you interviewed? I'm sorry if I missed that in your presentation.
That wasn't, we didn't specify that, so good question. So the participants had the option to either come to the Let's Beehive office for like an in-person interview, or to do one like using Zoom. And most of the interviews were done using Zoom. So we were able to like see people that way. We did have some people who did not want to be on camera. And what we found was that like some of the people who were like fraudulent responses would not want to be on camera, or like there were some shady things that happened when we were trying to do the interview process, which was also a signal that there was a concern about those people.
Yeah, so for the verification process, we didn't record that because we couldn't keep track of their exact address, but a lot of people showed their face, and that was one of the requirements, that they had to show their face, show either their ID, a copy of a utility bill for the local area, but they had to show some proof, and they weren't offended, or it didn't deter them from any way, but a lot of them, I think Zoom did work very well for this process, and we were able to record, once they verified that they were who they said they were, and then we could move forward. So then they were able to either turn their screens off if they wanted to, but majority of the women that we interviewed, they did do Zoom. There were a few that were in the office one-on-one in person. But it was very well received with the Zoom interviews.
Actually, another.
actually, Meredith has her hand up.
I know.
Oh, okay. Oh, you see it too. Okay.
Question. It's like, how big is Meredith? I'm sorry, I'm doing this. How big is Orange County? I mean, is it a big county where it would take, 30 to 40 minutes for some of the people to get to the Beehive? Okay,
easily.
just to have an idea. And now I'm going to shut up. I'm sorry.
You can ask as many questions as you'd like.
Yeah, but I keep cutting poor Meredith off.
That's okay. It's okay.
Orange County is pretty big. Yeah, it's very big. You can get, I mean, we're central. We're located in a central area of Orlando. So for anybody in any of even the outlines of Orange County, the furthest places out were probably at least 25 minutes each way, 25 to 30 minutes each way.
Okay, thanks.
So I had a couple of questions, and I apologize if you've already covered them and I just missed the details. I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff here. The main two, my first question was, is there something sort of like positive in your reach that I mean, clearly you were sort of flooded with responses. And so I've been on many studies where you just sort of feel like, oh my gosh, we can't get anybody. And you certainly don't want to be flooded with fraudulent responses. So, but I'm curious if there was something that would be a lesson for people like, hey, this really works. You should be prepared for this kind of outreach to be successful and have these in place. And then the second question I had was something that has also come up in other studies, which is, do you think there was something either about your study or your structure that maybe made this something that people who would not really have been eligible for want to participate in? I guess I'm thinking of it, I'm on a study now that I will say, I think the study is like not the most thrilling. And I think the cash incentive is like a little high to sort of compensate for the fact that it's not that thrilling of a study. And I think as a result, we're kind of getting people who are like, I'll talk about whatever you want me to talk about. So I didn't know if there was anything that you felt like, oof, this maybe contributed to maybe more interest than we expected.
Andrea, do you want to address the first question?
Yeah, I would love to. So what happened is we created, through our Facebook page, I created a Facebook ad, and that generated leads that way. So of course, technology was, I think, a big part of that overwhelming flood. And so what I ended up doing is going into that ad where we could edit it and make it more targeted and narrowed it down even more geographically. And there were also some confusions with Orange County, Florida versus Orange County, California. So then we did get some people who were from California that really still weren't in our geographical area. And then also with us being a community partner, we service women in Orange, Osceola, and Seminole County. So we even work outside of Orange County, and we could not, enroll women even outside of the community here. So I think that is a limitation, just being so restricted geographically, that we were only focused on Orange County, and in our county kind of being a tri-county area where a lot of people come into Orlando to do things as far as working, shopping, things of that sort, so those were some of the great things I think that came out of it, was incorporating technology to help with recruitment and the Facebook ads. But you just have to be very strategic with the interest and really tailoring that ad to make it more specific to hopefully reach the population that you're actually trying to reach. And so once we made those changes, we were able to help narrow down the people who were actually completing our interest form, and it seemed like that was helpful. And then the second thing that I feel like worked really well with recruitment for us and partnering with community partners is we partnered with a lot of other, prior to this research study, we partnered with about 30 plus other community-based partnerships. And so we were able to collaborate with our community partners for health fairs, for educating healthcare providers, and really tapping into the resource that we already had in order to help promote the research. And so we started more ground recruitment through health fairs and community outreach events, We changed our flyers in order to really narrow down. So then that way we use QR codes at the event. So when people were interested, and we kind of tried to do some pre-screenings, making sure, because Orlando's a tourist area too. So a lot of people travel here that aren't necessarily from here. And so trying to weed out those participants were people who were interested that we met at health fairs, but they weren't residents of Orange County. So I think that those are some of the high points that I think that worked really, really well for us.
And then Andrea, Alex has a question in the chat about why you chose Facebook versus something like TikTok or Snapchat, and whether or not that you end up with some demographic differences in choosing the platform.
Oh, that's a great question. So we are on Facebook, Instagram, as well as Twitter. We shared on Twitter, but our two most popular platforms that we currently have following on is Facebook, is where we get the most traction. And so that's why we started there. But Facebook and Instagram integrate. And so the same ad was also going on Instagram as well. So everything we posted on Facebook, we co-collaborated and put it on Instagram as well. But those are just where our two most populations are that we had the highest following. So that's just where we started with first. Now TikTok or Snapchat are two areas that I'm super interested in getting more involved in the upcoming years. I don't know a whole lot about it in that particular area, but I do know that those are two social media platforms that would be extremely well, depending upon who your target population is. And so a lot of our followers on Facebook and the demographics of who we're following, majority were women on Instagram and Facebook. Believe it or not, we almost have like a 60-40 split for men and women. And then based on the age range that we were looking on or looking for. But I think for TikTok and Snapchat, if they are research where you're trying to find the younger populations, that those two platforms would probably be better suited for those two demographics, just depending upon the age of who you're following is. So that's why we kind of chose those two platforms over the others. But hopefully in the coming years, we'll be able to branch out into TikTok and Snapchat for our youth prevention programs. It's definitely in the plan. So thank you for that question.
To add to what you're saying, Andrea, I'm on a communications committee for the School of Public Health here. And even though I'm not very technology savvy, what I notice is that there's a lot of use, at least for looking at programs to apply to. People are using LinkedIn. Young people are using LinkedIn. So I would, I don't know, how much it is there to support research efforts, but I was very, very surprised because I always looked at it as kind of, the businessman's, social media. But no, evidently there's a lot of young people that use LinkedIn for at least looking for academic programs, and possibly maybe they would be interested in research. So I'd suggest, finding out about that as well as TikTok and Snapchat. These things change so quickly that, what's in today may not be in tomorrow.
Totally agree. Thank you for that. Yeah, LinkedIn is definitely an underutilized resource that we actually just created, oh man, I think at the end of last year, where we branched out into LinkedIn a little bit, but it's in the works for 2024. But I agree.
Yeah, I was surprised. When these students were saying, "Oh yeah, we went to LinkedIn to look at the different," and quite frankly, institutions are advertising on LinkedIn. Are putting information about their programs on LinkedIn.
So I had two thoughts. One thought, like, is regarding like the various platforms and just using it for recruitment for a project like this, especially one that's community based. I think about how with like Andrea and Let's Beehive as a community partner, an important decision is to make is has to be related to where the connections are already in place, like where ground has already been laid. If we're doing community-based work, like where has the community partner really already sown some really good seeds and has those connections and leveraging that. And whereas like TikTok and Snapchat are great options and LinkedIn as well, like for Andrea, she has found this has established really a community through these other mechanisms that it really makes sense to like leverage those. And also another thought I have related to that is just given like the global reach, for instance, of Facebook, one of the things that I thought about when we were trying to figure out what to do with these fraudulent responses was that it just made me think about how important this topic is globally, and how like there are women in various parts of Africa who were looking for information, were thinking about HIV prevention. Like it was an important topic to them, and even for those who sort of got through, and we were asking them like, what made you be interested in this project? Like they were saying things like, I wanted information. And so it just like one of the things that I thought about was how there is like a desperate need, a dire need for continued engaged like information, dissemination of information in various parts of the world for Black women of all nationalities. Um, and even though this is not the study for them, there needs to be something for those people at the same time. So that was just another thought that I had related to that issue when we were going through it.
For sure. A follow-up question for you both, Andrea and Richelle, and Shan-Estelle, is how much, since you were going to health fairs and you were doing that kind of community-based outreach, did you evaluate how many, what was the effectiveness of that person, that in the moment health fair presentations, things like that, versus the social media for recruitment? What was the return on your investment, if you will, for going to health fairs or other things that you talked about, Andrea, versus the social media route of recruitment?
This is such a good question. And I think that I can just recall being at events where we had personal touch, where it was like a realness that people could trust. And so particularly with this target population with Black women, there's a medical mistrust issue. And so I think, one, I'm a healthcare provider and there's trust there where it's unbiased. And then two, we look like them. We look like the target population who we're trying to reach. And so that was a big part of being in person with health fairs, discussing issues that affected our community. And they know that we were from the community. And then also working with organizations, two of our most prominent universities here in Orlando. And then we're supported by the Florida Department of Health. So to have these three organizations with women who look like the community that we're targeting, and then we serve this community. I mean, there were women who were ready to do the interview on site right then. And I remember when Dr. Brown and I were at a particular health fair, feel free to jump in too, but Shan-Estelle and I, we were at an event and there were women coming up and they would talk to us and they would come through, but then they would come back. And then they would share stories with us. And there were women that were, one particular lady, and I don't know what it is, but I've had several instances where women would come and talk with me and they would start crying, where it was that much of an impact being in person to see that there's people who actually care about the topic and care about what people are going through. And I think having that level of groundwork, that I'm not too high up, and none of us were too high to be on the grounds in the community, in the trenches where the community is, really using our voices and our efforts and energy and time, that I think that they had more of an appreciation for. And those are things that you can't get on social media. Even through Zooms, may not always have like the personal touch, but this is such a delicate situation with Black women, and then also trying to find the time to balance all of these things. And so us having the opportunity to do virtual, in person, you know, offering opportunities for based on their comfort level, you know, not applying pressure. But I think overcoming trust was one of the biggest things that we were able to accomplish. That was a very good part of our research. And so even with our stakeholder group, a lot of the women who we interviewed wanted more information and wanted to participate with us more. And so there were women who we interviewed now who have become a part of our stakeholder group and are helping us analyze the data. And we've also learned through that process, through our stakeholders, and at every meeting that we've had, it has been so reassuring to hear from the women in our community that live here that they are so happy to see other women who look like them, who are focused on this area. And that has probably been one of the most rewarding experiences from this research, to know that all of the work that we're putting in is not in vain, and that, you know, they're talking to their families, they're talking to their communities, and it's through word of mouth that, you know, now once we close research, everybody's like, oh, well, this, I have a friend who wants to do an interview, and they're bringing, you know, more of their communities with them, and then also bringing other areas of the concern, so we can really truly identify what the barriers are. But one thing I will say is they are excited that their voices are even being heard and listened to and being valued and appreciated. And those are things that it's really hard to do virtually. And so having that personal touch in the one-on-one aspect of it, and knowing that there's a level of discreetness and amenity, that they can still remain anonymous if they want to, but still be able to share their experiences that are hard to talk about when it comes to sexual health. And in order for us to really overcome a lot of these barriers, these are the things that we need. And we need other healthcare providers to understand the different nuances of Black women in a diverse culture. There's so many different cultures, but even through that, there's still a common thread amongst all of the women that we've seen. And so I can't wait to get to the final results of our concept map, and like really get to the point to where they can actually see what we've done, and then also see if we can maybe potentially have this research project grow and be duplicated in other areas. But there is a need, and I think that this population is hungry, as Richelle mentioned. There's a dire need, not here in Orange County, but nationally and globally as well. So,
well, I want to thank you all. I want to be respectful of people's times. I think that this is an important project that you are undertaking, and we will love to hear more about as you analyze the data and come back and tell us all about it. This has really been a wonderful presentation. So thank you all. Are there any other questions? Yeah. Well, happy Thanksgiving to you all. It's great to meet you, Dr. Dunn and Dr. Joe, and always a pleasure, Shan-Estelle.
Thanks for
come back and talk to us about it some more.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Take care.